Appreciate you all being here. Just a reminder, make sure you're on mute while we have the seminar. Any questions as we go, you can type them in the chat, but normally we wait until the end to ask questions. So please raise your hand at the end or come back on camera and feel free to ask questions at the end. And just a reminder that this seminar will be recorded because we all want to hear Peyman again and again and again. But the discussion at the end won't be recorded, so we can speak a bit more freely then. So it gives me great pleasure this morning to introduce one of my psychology colleagues who's a relatively new member of WOW. We're very pleased that Peyman's joined us in WOW. So Peyman has been with psychology, it's only been a couple of years, but it feels like I've known you a long time, Peyman, but it's only been a couple of years. And Peyman did his PhD at QUT and a couple of years ago. And today he's going to talk to us about some of the conceptual issues around migration, gig work, and sustainable career development. And it's all about decent work and how we can promote decent work. So, oh, hi, Giles. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, Peyman. Please, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Paula. Let me just go through the slides again, and I think it will take a while again because I uploaded it once and it's asking me to upload again.
Are you okay? Yeah, just to share. Yeah.
Yes. Can you see them now?
Yep.
All right. Okay, thank you, and I'd like to begin. But so to begin this, I'd like to make a few notes about this presentation on such topic. What I am going to outline here today is going to be mostly some sort of a theoretical basis for conceptualization of a new perspective on career development of migrants and how, as a field, we need to pay more attention to their career development. Obviously, there is a lot of evidence that informs such conceptualizations, but as a constructivist researcher, I value telling my audience about where such musings about the topic and you know, my curiosities and concerns come from. So it becomes important to highlight my role as a researcher here in this territory of attending to migrants' career development. Obviously, as a migrant myself, who has had many privileges, including having access to a career that to a large degree appears to be sustainable, at least I hope. And on such backgrounds of moving around in a few countries, I've had the honor of knowing many people on the move, friends, colleagues, or neighbors, or people on the go who, you know, I feel a sense of commitment to their well-being and their hopes, realizing that in some way or another, many of them were somewhat forced into migration, but they're not necessarily refugees. So this will be somewhat more clarified today. I was telling you about some of these backgrounds as they shape my views as a researcher, these ideas and backgrounds that have a huge influence on my, you can say, axiological assumptions. Apart from my informal but often long conversations with rideshare drivers, which I'm sure many of you might have had, I have so far conducted a couple of interviews with migrant gig workers. That part of the project is still ongoing. And in addition to that, with Associate Professor Mary McMahon and myself, we have recently submitted a manuscript a while ago on this whole topic that I'm presenting today to the International Journal for Educational and Vocational Guidance, and we received very good response from them last week, so hopefully it will be published soon. So let's go on to the presentation now. We probably all know that over the past few decades, secure lifetime careers are mostly being replaced with an over to you philosophy, and this is trending, becoming the new norm in many ways as time passes. the ownership and responsibility for career planning, career management are all simply delegated to the individual employee more and more. And in some cases, people who work for an organization might not even be considered as employee. And with all this, when our societies are coming to a critical juncture, if we don't carefully manage and consider the consequences of this rapid transformation in our world of work, we know that we will face growing levels of unemployment, underemployment, inequality and instability across many parts of the world, but more so for the disadvantaged and less privileged populations, groups of people. Such needs and priorities were also highlighted by the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, as its Goal 8 outlined clearly that we need to promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and reproductive employment and decent work for all. But what is decent work, and where does it actually meet sustainable careers? The ILO has outlined the decent work is considering it as work that is productive, with fair income, some degree of security and social protection, with better prospects for personal development and social integration, freedom to express concerns, organize and participate in decision makings, and as well gender equalities and other kinds of opportunities. When we consider careers, we might be able to see some connections, some overlaps there, especially where the above definition highlights better prospects for personal development and social integration. When we know that career development concerns lifelong development in mostly an area of work that is meaningful to the person. Sustainable career development was introduced recently, an area of interdisciplinary research between vocational psychology, career development and counseling, career guidance. For example, McDonald and Hyde highlighted that a sustainable career includes sufficient economic security, matching the individual's career with their values, adapting to the evolving changes of individuals' needs and interests, and renewal opportunities for the person. But focusing on the overlapping boundary between decent work and sustainable careers, we can note that even decent work is becoming less and less. Decent work doesn't necessarily simply translate into sustainable careers. Again, over the past few decades, we can clearly see patterns that even decent work is becoming less and less possible for an increasing number of working people across the globe. And that is why many people in our field, along with the ILO, are now calling for the notion of decent work as human rights. I will come back to this later today to talk about decent work as human right, as it sort of intersects with some of the other human rights that I focus on today. One type of work that is emerging in our work orders, in our new work orders, is gig work. And app-based gig work is a major type of that. We have had gig works for a long time, and not all gig workers are obviously app-based. But our focus here is on this kind of app-based gig work that relies on contingent labor through use of electronically mediated arrangements and platforms in which people find short-term tasks and then get connected to clients, and once they complete the task, they get a chunk of the money that the client pays to the platform. Obviously, a variety of such platforms now provide individuals the ability to choose when and where to work, either remotely or in person. It's almost impossible to really measure the real size of the app-based gig economy that is being constructed and conducted globally, since most companies don't really share their data. But we know that rideshare work, and all kinds of deliveries, such as food delivery, grocery, or parcel deliveries, are leading the gig economy in terms of the number of people who work in that sector. So what are the conditions of gig work? The question is it decent work? And the answer is perhaps obviously no in most cases. A wide range of research on this, and they all point to these kind of conditions. So app-based gig work that is dispersed, unorganized work. Workers are effectively self-employed and therefore completely responsible for their own personal, economic, and career planning, if there is at all such a thing, possible for them. Beyond these, there is a huge degree of wage and income insecurity. How much they earn in return for a day or an hour of work is somewhat unpredictable and could be easily get manipulated or changed by the platform without prior notice. Workers obviously don't have access to any of the conditions and benefits afforded to other workers who are considered as employees. So no leaves, no pensions, no superannuations, workplace insurance, etc., etc. And finally, this all brings us to the concept of work precarity. Reminds us of the new class in the making that was introduced by Standing in his book, The Precariat. He talked about the varieties of precariat and then went on to outline migrants as the primary victims among other groups of precariat. Okay. Talking about migrants, let's move into clarifications of the two globes, North and South, which could then help us understand some migration patterns, as you can see behind me, and later the Southern perspective on migration. The two globes concept was introduced to be a more useful alternative, a more open and value-free kind of alternative to terms that we used in the past, such as the third world, or even to avoid some potentially valuing terms like developed countries or developing countries and underdeveloped countries. All right. But where is the North? Where is the South? Here is the map, and obviously the blue countries constitute the global North. The red countries are the global South. So it's not like it has absolutely nothing to do with the geographic location of countries, as you can see in this map. With the exception of a few countries, including Australia, the global North is mostly in the North. But it's still many countries in the Northern Hemisphere are actually a part of the global South. The criteria for such grouping was based on socioeconomic and political characteristics that I clarify soon. Go to the next slide. For example, if you take a look at this Global Human Development Index map, we will see how most of the countries of the global South that you saw in the previous slide are also not doing so well with their Human Development Index. On a different map, on this one, when we consider the OECD countries, the countries of who are the member of Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, we can see that most of its member countries are forming the global North. I provided these two maps to only better clarify the so-called North-South divide here. So, as we saw in the previous maps and the clarifications of the global North, global South, global North is mainly consisted of most OECD countries with high development, high Human Development Index, and those economically developed. And in the South, those ranked lower on the Human Development Index. Those we used to refer to them as developing countries, maybe sometimes under the discourse of seeing development predominantly from an economic perspective. But then we need to note that this is the majority word. The global South is the majority word when we compare the population and population trends of the two globes. And we also have those economically depressed groups living in the global North, such as many migrants who are from the South and are among the precariat here. Now, with this new conceptualization of the two globes, let's review a few points on global migration. Majority of our global migration over the past century used to occur within the global South. As you can see in the map behind me, I'm sure it's very small now, but there's a lot of migration that often used to occur within Africa, which is part of the global South. So migration was mostly about people moving from one southern country to another. However, during the past decade, the south to north numbers are increasing steadily. More people are moving from the global south to the global north compared to the past. For example, in 2019, 38% of global migration was from south to south countries. You can see how movement within the south was still the biggest chunk. But then we have 35% of global migration that was from south to north, and 20% within the global north, and only 6% from north to south. We also need to note that southern migrants are also a major part of the migrant movement within the north. So a major part of that 20% that moves within the north could still be related to previous year southern migrants who moved into a northern country, worked somewhere for a while, and then move into another northern country for different reasons, often for work again. Someone coming to Australia, working here for a couple of years, then going to Canada or Europe working again, but they're originally from the south. And then finally, we need to note that in 2019, the global population of migrants were estimated to be just over 272 million people, more than 75% of them being people from the global south. All right, so with the rising number of southern migrants, and more specifically those migrants who are moving into the global north, we need to consider migrants and the employment in the post-migration context here. Since 2010, over 2 million migrants have entered Australia, over 70% of them being permanent settlers, most of them through Australian government's skilled migration and family and then humanitarian programs. The rest of those 2 million are international students, among whom many are potentially future settlers, future permanent settlers. When we look at the countries like Australia with comprehensive migration programs, we see that migration programs are actually designed to sustain global north countries' declining population growth rates, tackle the aging of population, and to foster economic growth in the context of an abundance of capital and a scarcity of labor. Hence, many migrants settled in Australia are so-called skilled workers. Okay, but since I highlighted that maintaining this thing called population growth rate, maintaining population growth rate is perhaps an imperative for most of the global north countries at this point, I must explain that population growth rate is calculated based on the sum of natural birth in each country and net overseas migration. So when we, for example, look at the case of these two countries, Australia and Canada, we can see how the population growth rate is heavily linked to maintenance of net overseas migration. All right. Therefore, among many other factors related to population and its subsequent economic growth could potentially lead to higher migrant intakes post-pandemic. Okay, we may see even surpassing of historic levels, I suppose. All right, let me just go to the next slide. But unfortunately, with such growing numbers of migrants, majority of them from the global south, coming through these skilled migration programs, there is no data on their employment outcomes in Australia, even for the skilled ones who went through such complex, extensive, and perhaps even expensive process of getting their work experiences and qualifications accredited, etc., to fill the so-called skill shortages here. Basically, we don't know, or at least the data is not made publicly available, what sort of trends define their career development and employment outcomes post-arrival. It's as if we shouldn't care about this, all right? But we know that such a focus on migrant employment outcomes have been a historic priority in the fields of vocational psychology and education, career development, career guidance and counseling. When we look at the works of pioneers and social activists such as Frank Parsons in the United States, Etta St. John Willeman in Canada, and we have Carolyn Chisholm in Australia, who were among such example pioneers. On such background, that precarization of work often first challenges those groups of people such as southern migrants And that is how platform labor we see is an alarming situation of increasing precarity that threatens the well-being and livelihood of many migrants. I'm kind of going to provide a little bit of background on what's happening to migrant gig workers here and the employment context around that. We can see that platform labor is becoming predominantly migrant labor in many of the northern countries. In Australia, the Victorian government reported that migrant workers are 1.5 times more likely to engage in what they call gig work, which is app-based gig work, compared to other Victorians. And this is the case in many of the other northern countries, including the United States and Canada. And before I continue, I need to emphasize that talking about decent work, talking about sustainable careers, which I'll go back to them again later, we need to highlight that many gig workers, including the migrant gig workers, want to transition out of gig work. And in saying that, I also acknowledge that not all gig workers may want to transition out of gig work. You know, some of them obviously might be simply happy with whatever gig arrangements they have for various reasons. And this includes some very specific groups of migrants. I acknowledge that they could be happy with their gig work, but the majority of them probably prefer to transition out of these kind of arrangements. What needs attention here is that when we talk about decent work and sustainable careers, our focus is on a group who wants to transition out of gig work. Most of them have qualifications, maybe years of previous work experience in other fields prior to migration, and now they face some major complications for transitioning out of gig work. This means that they really want to get out of it, do what is meaningful to them, work as an employee where their skill set is required, and this is more aligned with that decent work agenda. But these people are often caught in a sort of catch-22 situation where they need to continue working in those gig arrangements to support themselves and their families. All right. So in this way, gig work could act like a double-edged sword. For some migrant gig workers, it works, and they might even enjoy the flexibilities. I acknowledge that it offers, them probably a pathway to self-sufficiency or financial independence, at least temporarily. But for many, the conditions of gig work often operate against the long-term career planning. After arriving in their new countries, for many migrants, finding relevant employment in areas of previous work that is aligned with the qualifications could take a while, for some even months or maybe years. And many Southern migrants, therefore, are left with almost no choice. So they begin with gig work, thinking it will but just be a temporary thing, but then eventually that catch-22 situation won't let them will leave them much time to attend and prepare for their career development after migration. And gradually, to survive, they won't even have time to apply for relevant positions or learn about employment seeking strategies in a world of work that is very much different compared to what they know of. So this lack of time for doing other preparatory tasks around career development, becoming familiar with the new employment context, it becomes a precursor to what we can consider as social isolation in some ways. For example, they won't even have the ability to build networks over time. Their skills might depreciate and become redundant, as our world of work here is rapidly changing in these northern countries. And whatever career development might have even been achieved by them prior to migration is now heavily disrupted in their new post-migration context because of the precarious gig work arrangements. So we can see how sustainable development and career sustainability for most of these migrant gig workers is somewhat impossible, considering that career sustainability was a complex phenomenon requiring us to take a dynamic and systemic perspective to simultaneously consider the person, their context, and their development over time. We probably need to understand the context of their migration in a more, what I refer to, and as Geertz used to put it, in a more experienced near perspective, so that it perhaps a new perspective on migration could help us better understand those kind of experiences and challenges as well. adopting a new perspective could also help us renew our roles as researchers, activists, or practitioners to respond effectively to any needs or gaps in that. So a Southern perspective on migration was initially introduced, and that is the new perspective I'm referring to. It was initially introduced by Monk and Wise in 2008. It challenges the predominant discourse on migration, which has historically been a Northern perspective. That Northern perspective on migration is often critical of the act of migration, and it has a specific kind of narrow focus on Southern migrants in the global North. And with that narrow focus, it then views migration primarily as a beneficial process for the migrants and for their families, perhaps back home in the South, and even their countries of the global South, countries of origin, if you want to refer to it. It ignores migrants' contributions to the global North countries. That predominant Northern perspective on migration has been historically amplifying two narratives. First one was that it views international migration as a threat, and then it also views migration as an irregular act. When the Southern perspective challenges that predominant discourse, considers migration as a human right, and emphasizes that migration as a broad concept appears to be more beneficial for the countries, for the Northern countries, rather than the Southern countries. I'm not going to get into the details of that. It also invites us to pay more attention to structural injustices and the dynamics of uneven development in the 21st century, and how such trends continue to inflate the proportion of marginalized and disadvantaged in the global South. Then, considering the situations in many of these Southern countries, we need to note that their volatile economic and political context, or in some cases how climate change is also causing human movement and will soon even increase in certain regions. Even the implications of this COVID pandemic, they all contribute further to ongoing instability in the global South, and we can see how all these fuel human movement as they leave no room for development in many of those Southern countries. So with such consideration, the Southern perspective highlights the need to broaden the notion of forced migration, and perhaps consider that many migrants, including some of those who are, for example, moving into Australia under skilled or family streams, could actually potentially fall under the category of forced migrants. So Southern perspective on migration expands the concept of, aims to expand at least the concept of forced migration. With this broadening of the concept of forced migration, we can see that often changes at a global level have impacted these Southern migrants in the first place, and sometimes follow them into more vulnerable positions after migration, when we know that post-migration context is also filled with experiences of downward career mobility, lack of access to decent work, career depreciation, and so forth for many migrants. Overall, then, adopting this Southern perspective on migration, considering migration as human rights, very well aligns with the social justice foundations of our fields, and then the recent calls by the ILO who advocates for decent work as a human right. When we consider both of them, both migration and decent work as human rights, we can see how the Southern perspective potentially offers a new vantage point for prioritizing various groups of migrants' employment and career development outcomes after migration. It helps us to see how attending to existing gaps in our works and systems over the long term is going to be crucial and also beneficial to both migrants as well as the receiving countries, the Northern countries' economies. Once a Southern perspective is adopted, we can better attend to the importance of paying close attention to the person, the context, and their developments over time, so that we can promote sustainable careers. What comes from this slide mostly informs career practice, including career counseling or vocational and career guidance practices, but obviously it could also inform research in many other interdisciplinary areas. For example, I highlight here 3 points about Southern migrants, gig workers, to expand our views about their career development and what we need to know before working with them as clients. The first one is that migrants obviously are a diverse and heterogeneous group. And diversity here doesn't simply limit to cultural, ethnic, or linguistic background. It also covers their various social classes or different vocational and educational backgrounds. So you can see how migrants may have diverse expectations and views about the nature and conditions of their gig work arrangements. This could be potentially informed by their financial expectations in relation to a minimum lifestyle that to some extent meets their pre-migration standards, whatever they were. I would say, for example, person A might be happy with their gig work for some time because of certain previous backgrounds that lower their expectations for a while, but it doesn't mean that they don't belong to the precariat still if they're happy with their work arrangements. And then finally, the third point is that career development is not understood the same way everywhere. In fact, in some languages, there are no distinct words differentiating between work, job, vocation, or a career. We also then need to understand the Southern countries' word of work and the predominant context of employment within the South, which is what these Southern migrants are familiar with in order to be able to help these migrants aim for developing careers here in the Northern countries. We need to know that almost all Southern countries have agrarian and industrial economies as opposed to service economies that dominate the global North. As a consequence, some migrants might have a very different view of career development and be unfamiliar with this post-migration world of work and its employment context. Another factor is that most Southern countries' economies are characterized by an abundance of labor and a scarcity of capital. That this is the opposite of the Northern countries' economy that have an abundance of capital for a scarcity of labor. All right. This has multiple implications for finding employment here after migration, because an abundance of labor in the South meant that while thousands of people with similar qualifications compete for a single position, the informality of economy determined that the person who often is chosen to fill that single position wasn't the most suitable, but the one with the right connections. This is a very familiar story for many Southern migrants from different countries. So, such economic factors, such employment complexities could over time discursively shape a somewhat different notion of career development among the Southerners. So there needs to be a stage at which career development in the North is deconstructed, is unpacked for them, right? I'm getting to the end, so 2 more slides. Considering all that we have covered so far, the paper that we have close to publication moves on to propose more detailed suggestions and proposal for career practice, working with Southern migrants who are trapped in that catch-22 situation, if you remember. We make a point that in line with the adoption of a Southern perspective on migration, we need to note that our career discourse practices are also mostly informed by a Northern neoliberal perspective. Nearly 10 years ago, people like Mary Sue Richardson made this point that dominant career discourse practices tend to psychologize and individualize vocational choice. It's like our practices promote a neoliberal approach to career development in which everyone presumably benefits from the same degree of volition. So we highlight that here that such a discourse runs the risk of marginalizing a variety of alternative possibilities and solutions when we work as practitioners with Southern migrants. Our individualized career practices often make invisible an area of contextual challenges that certain clients, such as these Southern migrants, face in their lives. So following those kind of suggestions, we rely on what was proposed by Hooley and Sultana and Thompson in their book on emancipatory career guidance, and make some very practical suggestions for career counselors and researchers who are engaged with Southern migrant gig workers. And finally, for career practice and research on Southern migrants, gig workers, these were some reflective questions to begin with. Questions that we don't know much about them in our fields, but can potentially help us develop some better strategies perhaps for responding to the career needs and also enhancing our responsiveness as a couple of different fields, but as a whole group of people who are concerned about them. That's it. Thank you so much. Now I'm happy to answer questions. I know there might have been many of them.
Thank you, Peyman. Thank you.